Welcome to the Purpose of Place podcast. I'm Despina Katsikakis, your host. I'm really honored and delighted to have as my guest here today, Dan Labbad, the CEO of the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate is the oldest and largest landowner in the UK and one of the largest landlords in central London, of course, with Regent Street and the St. James's portfolio. And we'll be talking about property predominantly. But Dan, the Crown Estate is significantly more than just property. So maybe just give us a bit of an overview.
Well, the Crown Estate is a unique organisation, and ultimately it is set up under the Crown Estate Act, 1961, but the organisation has been around for over 200 years. The Crown Estate has national land ownership, both on land, and it also owns and has the management of the seabed around England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And our role is to use that land on behalf of the country, to think about what the country needs and to empower that land on behalf of the country. So 100% of our net profits go back to the consolidated fund, and we're always putting our capital to work to, again, serve national needs, whether that's thinking about the future of London, thinking about the future of agriculture, or thinking about the future of the environment or renewable energy.
Well, I know your purpose is to create lasting prosperity. And that's a really interesting issue when we talk about property today, because this whole idea of how we think about incentivizing landowners to think about long-term prosperity and what does that mean becomes very interesting in an era where people are looking for returns on investment. How do you approach that?
Well, I think we're living in a period where some of the challenges that we face as a society, as a global community, and obviously as a national community are not going away. Climate crisis, the nature crisis, in this country, energy security, the need for economic growth, the need for equality in that economic growth. They're issues that challenge every institution and every individual that lives in modern society. And therefore, when you're responsible for an institution like the Crown Estate, you're compelled and responsible to ask yourself, what can we do to leverage the resources that we have, whether it's the land we own, the people we have, the partnerships we have, to have an impact to mitigate and help some of those challenges and opportunities. And I think property plays an important role in that. At the end of the day, we're human, we're spatial. Cities bring people together. Places bring people together. And how those places work in an era of environmental and social upheaval, it's a really interesting challenge for our day. And one thing we know is that the lessons of the past are not necessarily the teachings for the future. And so we're constantly working out, where do we use our experience and wisdom to help us do something, and when do we need to sort of break things a little bit to do things in a different way? To come to your question, Despina, about short-term versus long-term, it's a really interesting challenge, because I still feel that when you look at the way markets operate, they're still too short-term and ignore the real risks that we face, both as institutions but also as a society.
Yes.
And, if I'm going to, using a building as an example, if I'm going to sign off an investment deal on a building that's going to last for between 25 and 50 years in its economic assessment lifespan, I'm making assumptions today in a standard commercial assessment around what the world is that aren't really true. We don't really factor carbon into those discussions.
Right.
We don't factor what climate will do. We don't really factor even technology to the extent that's going to change things. So the question we're constantly asking ourselves isn't so much whether we're thinking about things in too much a short-term or too much a long-term way, but are we really assessing the risks for what they are? And are we thinking about our commerce in the context of those risks? Or are we pretending that certain risks just don't exist that in fact do, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. And of course, one of the things that makes me think about to hear you say that is it changes the way we need to measure value. Well, how do we measure value for society, value for the environment, value for return on investment. We keep measuring value in quite conventional ways in property, which leads us to think about single asset class investment rather than, for example, going back to what you said about the richness of cities and the impact cities have on people and society. We don't really think about the impact of districts as the value point. And I certainly hear a lot of discussion around that, but I'd be interested in your perspective because, of course, you manage and you operate more at that level of thinking about unified places.
The concept of unified places has been around for a long time because we've seen through history, the benefit of unified places in supporting the human condition, supporting human interaction, supporting civilization, and supporting progress. Today, the challenge is that we've got a few additional problems thrown into the mix. But what those challenges like climate change, like technology disruption do is they, I think, only bring into a more acute way the need for proper thought processes to go into placemaking. One of the things that I've always been a believer of is that the notion of curating a place from A to Z just doesn't work. No single group of people have the ability to work out what good looks like if you want to attract diversity, if you want to be inclusive. You've got to set places up so that they can become what they will become through inclusion and social interaction, and the users of that space defining for themselves. In fact, if you use an example, Victorian architecture, the way that it works today is very different to the way it works in the beginning, but when it was created. But it's a great example of how, well, it's a great example of a lot of things. It's a great example of standardized development and construction, but it's also a great example of how places will define themselves based on who uses them and who finds value in their use, social value, business value, or whatever commercial value, whatever that is. I do think that, coming back to your question, this concept of value, there's an IRR, an economic value variable, is in some ways really easy because you can measure it. There's a whole institution and global industry around what good looks like. The problem with it is that it doesn't capture all value. We're trying to monetize markets in order to help us understand them. For example, there's a big push at the moment to value nature in this concept of natural capital. And I think there's a lot of merit in that, don't get me wrong. But how do you value what is ultimately a public good? How do you value education? How do you value nature? How do you value mitigating risks against the climate crisis? How do you value apprenticeships and cultivating social mobility for a fairer world? How do you value those things? Now, coming back to this concept of unified places, we know through history that it's all of those things working combined that make great places. Yet we value things disproportionately that have a financial wrapper. And what we have to get better at in property, but across all industries, is seeing the wood from the trees in terms of the risks and opportunities that are defined by broader value that goes to, again, supporting what humans need to be prosperous in the broader sense of the word, and healthy and, upwardly human.
And it's interesting because it sort of comes right back to this prosperity issue, right? Because exactly what you said, how do you enable humans to be healthier, to thrive? If we think about cities, introducing nature in cities, we know makes a significant impact on the well-being of the citizens and the impact that it has on business. That prosperity of the community creates prosperity for business. So taking that lens of shifting away from thinking about the traditional monetary valuation into taking into account the wider societal in many ways, what we're often calling today the S in ESG,
absolutely.
and how we begin to impact that. It kind of brings me to the ESG discussion because obviously this is something you've been passionate about for a very long time. You were previously chairman of the UK Green Building Council. Who do you see driving and being responsible for the ESG agenda, and how important is it for you in your decisions today?
Well, I think a lot of people are driving the agenda. I think one needs to be very careful not to be self-righteous about these things. These are big challenges. And I do think that, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I do think in 20 years she's going to be judging me. I think our children are going to be really judging us on what we're doing today. Are we pushing and are we influencing? But I think a lot of people across government, across the private sector, across the third sector are really, really trying to grapple with this. And so I think what has changed over the years is, where 20 years ago when I was in my early years of building and discovering my passion for sustainability, where you'd have conversations with people within industry, probably at that time for me in property, and people's eyes would glaze over when you talked about this subject. Today, what happens almost always is you enter into a meaningful discussion about how you crack through the challenges, and they're the discussions we need to be having. Are we pushing ourselves hard enough? Because I think there is a difference between leadership and holding ourselves to account and the notion of progressive mediocrity where we're inching ahead. Because coming back to, again, where I begin, we don't have discretion over how the climate crisis and the nature crisis and the social issues we're facing will manifest.
Yeah.
We know today with the climate crisis and the nature crisis that it's going to hurt. The question is just how much. So bringing that back to those of us that are in roles of influence, and I don't want to be sounding idealistic here. I've run businesses for a long time. I've been around the block. I've had the hard knocks. This stuff is hard. I'm not denying that it's not hard. But are we doing enough given that it's going to hurt? So can we do more such that it hurts less?
Very important point, particularly given that the property industry, of course, is a significant contributor to the environmental challenges we face. Because how do you align infrastructure planning with zoning, with the development of property, so that they're all actually aligning to common, collective responsibilities towards society and towards longer-term outcomes? Are you able to almost cut across some of that in the Crown Estate, given the complexity and the breadth of the estate?
Yeah, I think coming back to the Crown Estate, I think that one of the reasons that we've held on to a contiguous ownership, meaning a single property ownership, give or take, in the centre of London, is because it gives us, the opportunity to influence the space between the buildings across 10 million square feet, across most of Regent Street and about half of St. James, and, have influence on how we solve and modernise, our estate, how we decarbonise the estate, how we green the estate, working in partnership with, Westminster, and thinking through some of those strategic challenges. So sitting here today, we are in partnership with Westminster on the park-to-park sort of vision, which is all about looking and reimagining with consultation and understanding what people want of the centre of London, and ensuring that we're not sort of just going in there with our, unique ideas, but using and doing proper engagement and defining how we green the city, defining, how traffic should work and how pedestrian movement should work, thinking about the future of, the urban form, thinking about the future of commerce and activation, because obviously we need to ensure that we are earning patronage. We have the ability to think about how we make our estate more inclusive, ensuring that it's there for everybody.
Right.
something that at times central London hasn't been. And I think that what we need to do as an industry is spend a bit more time taking a step back and say, we're all running races. Are we running the right race? Does policy work for us working with government? Is policy in the right place? And how do we engage in that debate?
Yeah.
How do we ask communities what they want? How do they feel about the future? What are their needs? Can we do that better? Can we think about the financial? Are we valuing things correctly? What is the pathways to break through some of the things that are holding us back? Like, for example, should we accelerate the way we think about embodied carbon? Should we be thinking differently about how we bring nature into the cityscape? Are there shortcuts that if we just put a bit of attention into them, we could actually change things quite quick, low-lying fruit? And then, what are the things holding back the engineering? Is it because we're all, for example, treating our ownership, in isolation? What if we talk together about how we solve the future of London as a digital city, the future of London as an environmental city? And I think there are things like that happening.
Yes.
Don't get me wrong. Could we be doing more in sort of almost taking a step back and shifting our perspective? And I'm a big believer in partnerships. I think we need partnerships like never before in industries like property if we are going to truly start to make a dent in some of these challenges.
Well, I think that alliance and partnership between particularly policy and industry is a critical one that has been missing from the property industry. And I had a conversation with Bill Hughes, who, as I'm sure you know, chairs the Property Industry Alliance. And one of his missions is to begin to create that aligned sense of purpose in the industry so that we can have those conversations to really drive that policy collaborative action.
When you look at the fragility of the markets that we operate in and you look at some of the challenges that we're collectively facing as businesses in property, collaboration not only across stakeholders like the Connected Places Catapult, but also across industry, working together as business in new ways, sharing knowledge and pooling our resources and collaborating are all going to be part of us supporting not only some of these challenges that I'm talking about, but also supporting our own futures as businesses.
Also, I guess collaboration with who your customer is, because that's changed dramatically in property in the last few years. It used to be very much a business-to-business relationship, but of course, it's become a business-to-end user and customer relationship. So that approach of collaboration, engagement, connection becomes even more important.
It does. And I think the definition of customers is also changing. As you say, customers are also at times your competitors these days with technology, but how you can work to provide solutions for them that meet their purpose and their growing needs is going to be fundamentally important. I think the customer landscape in property is going to continue to change. We are looking at the moment about the future activation of our property ownership across the country. What does that look like? We've recently done we've entered a partnership with the Oxford Science Enterprises and the Pioneer Group on supporting startups coming out of Oxford with lab space. And because if we don't focus on things like that, an important growth industry for this country. It's historically we've been wonderful in this space. We have to continue to be wonderful, but at the moment there is the risk of losing out to places like the US, which again we need to protect those things. So partnerships take all forms, but are incredibly important for what you're talking about. Coming back to customers, I think I talk a lot about the B2B sort of side of things, but I think what is growing increasingly just as important is the way we think about communities and the way that we think about the way that our brands and our reputation is going to reflect on what and how we're listening to them, whether it's consulting on the future of London or it's thinking about the future of renewable energy in this country. It's all about thinking about and talking to and listening to people on the ground and how they feel about the future and talking to stakeholder groups that represent them. Because you tend to find with some of these challenge is they're not an exact science. And you can have the best data and evidence in the world, but unless you're engaging with stakeholders in order to validate what that data and evidence is telling you, you're not going to have a license to operate. So it's important that you're straddling both.
Creating that evidence base becomes critical. And of course, that expanded sense of partnership and engagement with the community. I know you're a fan of positive urbanism, progressive urbanism, which is very much linked to that whole issue of engagement. And I certainly from what you're saying, it feels to me that you can lead the way and create aspirations for many in the industry to follow because you've been setting up these types of partnerships. You have the breadth of the estate to do so. If we were to say, given this context of unprecedented change, what is the one thing that we could do today to really make an impact in the industry?
There's no silver bullet. I should say that, first of all. If there was, we would have corralled around it. These things are complex. Like if you were to say to me, what are the few things we could do? I think firstly, setting up processes that come together and at the systems level, work with stakeholders in defining what good looks like. I think half the challenge is if you take a group of people and put them in a room, all of whom believe in, let's say, modern urbanism and progressive urbanism and, all believe in addressing the climate crisis, let's use that as an example, and you ask them, okay, what does that mean for you? Everyone will have a different answer. And I think, in a liberal, independent society, there is freedom of thought, which is, so wonderful. But at the same time, it means that we all have different perceptions and definitions, often of the same thing, when we're aligned, let alone when we're not aligned. Yeah. And I don't think our processes invests enough in what are we trying to solve for here? What does good look like? What is paramount? And how do we develop pathways to work together in not only defining it, but also then delivering against that? And how do we work through challenges in that, on that journey? And good stakeholder engagement, good community engagement does that. You'll know that from your experience. Yeah. You can do that when you're focused on an outcome that people rally around, and then you get into the definitions of what that means and you work through those. And you're open and you're able to collaborate and compromise. You can do some big things. That's not easy as a process, but it's fundamental because otherwise what you're doing is you're trying to shoehorn things through. And, I would argue that, life's too short to keep doing that for the next 50 years. The other thing is that we start to pick on, these areas that we know from a risk perspective, start to think about risk. And I think there are some mechanisms to do that. TCFD, there's a nature equivalent of TCFD, using those devices that exist and really looking at, don't have them just sitting in the back of an annual report, but actually use them as a core business device. So I think, to answer the question, I think some of the tools are there. The question that I ask is, are we using them effectively enough? Bringing it back to the Crown Estate, one of the things that we are constantly grappling with is how are the decisions, because the importance that we have in protecting what we own for the future and protecting the integrity of the Crown Estate, how are the decisions that we make today going to be thought of in the future? And I'm not talking about 50 or 100 years, I'm talking about in the next 5 or 10. So if we make a embodied carbon decision today on a building that works against, let's say, the carbon trajectory set by government policy, set by the Paris Protocol or other measures we use, whilst today it might be completely legal to make a range of decisions, how will that decision be looked at in 10 years from now? Will that be seen as a good decision? And we're finding even today we are subject to freedom of information requests as the Crown Estate, like all of government is. And what's interesting when you get a request on a decision that was made 30 or 40 years ago is people judge those decisions through a 2024 values lens. And because of the change that we're dealing with and the issues that we're dealing with, I think that 20 to 30 years is very quickly becoming 15, 10, and soon it'll be 5. And do you see what I mean? So I think, again, coming back to this risk point.
Yeah, and the risk is really interesting because, of course, what you're describing is that decisions that you make by having this, let's call it social accountability, environmental accountability, actually ultimately are decisions that are good for business as well.
Yeah.
But having that long-term view allows you to make those decisions in a good way that will provide that future outcome. But you need to have that future vision, which, again, not necessarily everyone in the industry has.
But the real prize is in this sort of concept of aligning the politics, the finances, and the engineering and driving the systems change, because it's about getting the system to move as well as individual leadership. You can't have one or the other. You need both.
I agree so much with everything you've said, Dan. And the challenge is, who is going to help make that happen? Who can actually lead this?
My argument is it needs to be everybody. I don't think, again, there's one group. I don't think it's the government alone. I don't think it's a private sector alone. I don't think it's a third sector. I think it's everyone. We all have a responsibility. And how, with an eye to the future, do we come together to focus on the issues of today, but also start to get smarter in a collaborative way as to how we, pull down the barriers? Because, sitting here today, I think it's completely acceptable to say, I need to hit my results in 6 months from now, because we all have KPIs. But in 5 years from now, 10, I can do a lot more to make sure that I'm being more holistic in my outcomes than I can in 6 months from now. And that requires broad collaboration. When I've seen things happen that have impact, and I've given you one example of an impact that's happening in this country around the future of renewable energy, where we have a British success story. That is a British success story because of industry, because of government, because of unique players like the Crown Estate, because of the third sector and their support, because of communities. It has required everyone in the system to come together. Yeah. So I think this isn't about one group leading the way. This is everybody doing their bit to lead. And I think, somebody could argue, oh, that's so idealistic. We have examples now of where that has happened and where that's working. We need to learn from those examples.
Well, I think that's a very inspirational call to action, Dan. And I do hope that as an industry, we take on that collective responsibility and accountability for a more resilient future for communities, society, the environment, and business, of course. So maybe I'll thank you at this point for your amazing contribution and for joining us today.
Thanks, Despina. Thank you very much.